All right, welcome everybody. This is the second talk in the RL mini series of March, where Mani is gonna address the three dogmas that Dave just presented last week and shed light on them, shed evolutionary light on them. But yeah, before we start, Mani, do you mind telling us a little bit about yourself, your background, your research interests, and what kind of thought process led you to write this paper?
Yeah, it's a bit of a convoluted path, I guess, towards this paper in particular. My background was in my undergrad in biophysics and math, and then I did a master's in genome science and went on working in the biotech world for a few years. Worked in an antibody discovery company. Um, all along, I was really interested in questions of like what is life? Like Schrodinger's book was really influential, I suppose, back when I read it in undergrad, doing taking mostly physics curriculum alongside some biology electives on the side. And also even before that, I would say I think it was like after high school, I came across this book called Biomimicry. I forget the author's name. But in it, it had a lot of really fascinating like a list of fascinating solutions that biology had come up with, evolution had come up with to solve these very almost like menial like engineering problems, right? Like I remember that of some crab that used its this massive force to like knock out its prey underwater. That one really stuck, um, but yeah, I actually was torn between biophysics and cognitive science. UBC, where I did my undergrad, was offering cognitive science for the first time that year, and um, I don't know. I think it was just a sense of like naive like reductionism that led me to study biophysics instead. Just kind of thinking that, again, I would say naively at the time that. Um, like I would have to have to understand how a cell works before I understand how a brain works. That sort of like super simple-minded thinking. But yeah, that kind of stuck with me, that interest in both cognitive science and biophysics. Right after I finished my master's, I saw a talk by Terence Deacon at a sister university in Vancouver, SFU. Um, it basically tied the two worlds together for me, like the two worlds being of biophysics, questions of evolution, origin of life, um, the link between metabolism and information, these sorts of ideas that have been sort of floating around in the biophysics space for a while now. And questions of cognitive science, like Terence Deacon wrote his first book on the symbolic species. For me, that was also always, like many people, I suppose, a big question as to the origins of language and symbolic abstract representations, how these emerge, right, as life gets more and more complex. And most importantly, I think for relevant for this talk, his second book, which is what he was presenting on, called Incomplete Nature, was essentially tackling this age-old question, the is versus ought, the sort of mind-body dualism, and sort of working up from the very beginnings of life to some a different paradigm, right, as Dave would call it, for tackling these questions that avoids two fundamental problems. Right, one is it avoids these homuncular solutions, right, where this sort of force vital or some magical entity that you just pass your explanatory buck to becomes the thing that your theory centers around without explaining. And on the other hand, avoiding this other trap, which is what he calls these golem theories, right? This that all these things like agency, consciousness, sentience, etc., are nothing but epiphenomenal illusions. There's nothing to explain here, right? Sort of line of thinking. The idea being that there is an actually interesting story, a naturalistic story to be told about at the very least, the origin of life, right? Like there's this long gap between the origin of life and consciousness, and I don't think anyone claims that they have a good account of it, least of all Terry. But But for me, that very first step, that of the origin of life, and again, like linking these ideas of metabolism and information together, really was sort of the idea that made me just quit my job and start looking for a PhD and hoping to pursue some of these questions. And I thought that, I was, this was back in like 2019, AI was really booming and RL had already made its sort of foray into actual pragmatic world of problem solving and control. And I thought that, well, RL seems to be tackling the problem of agency, right? So that's where I should go. And I guess I was up for a bit of a disappointment. This is yet again my naivete kind of taking me down a path that has led me here, I suppose. So I don't know if that may have been more than you were hoping for, but that's kind of
Oh, no, that was perfect. Thanks for that detailed explanation. I mean, you mentioned Deacon's book, Incomplete Nature, and also this idea that metabolism and information processing is coupled in biological systems and it's decoupled in AI systems. I think I just want to use this opportunity to highlight. I think that's one of the biggest missing pieces in today's AI. And if you look at a transformer, they process every token equally. Like there's no sense of computational value that they judge based on like how many joules of energy this consumes. So I find that very fascinating, and I think you probably are going to talk about that because I saw it in your papers. So very, very much looking forward to it. Yeah. One last question. So Terrence is actually your co-author in this paper. So what happened? Like you just saw his talk and then you just reached out and was like, let's write a paper. How did it go?
Yeah, no, actually, after the talk, this was at the end of my master's degree, and I was frankly quite sick of academia and science and everything to do with it. So I just went on a sort of a world tour, so to speak, and I kind of forgot about the talk, to be honest. I did buy the book,
Mm.
and eventually I asked my family to send a copy of the book to me while I was traveling and started reading it. And I remembered why I was so excited about it. And basically, back then, this is 2014, 15, I wrote like a little PhD proposal and sent it to Terry, and he liked it. And he basically invited me over to Berkeley. And so I spent a little bit of time in Berkeley actually, and a lot of folks at Redwood actually were super gracious to have me at their lab meetings. I just want to sort of give a tip of my hat to the folks there. It's one of the more sort of open and friendly communities out there,
Oh yeah.
and yeah, basically I got that job offer and I ended up going down the biotech path. And he is in the Department of Anthropology. He's very much a neuroscientist by training, whereas I was interested in pursuing these things through the computational lens, right? And our paths kind of temporarily diverged. I very much kept in touch and sort of tried to follow up on his more recent ideas, which sort of were much more heavily evolutionary, I suppose, going back to his sort of evolutionary roots. Yeah, and I just basically I have been in touch since, and I continue to be very much inspired by a lot of his ideas, and when I saw David's, I've been wanting to sort of write this stuff in some like package. I want to package a lot of these ideas, which are quite disparate, as you might have been able to tell from sort of the intro I gave, for a few years. And when I saw this frame workshop at RLC, finding the frame workshop, I was like, this is my opportunity to do this. And I started writing, and it was a bit of a mess, and I couldn't really bring like these ideas together. And then like 2 weeks before the deadline, I came across David's paper from RLC the previous year, and it just like kind of it all like it provided this scaffolding where all these ideas kind of like fell together, and I could directly format and organize a lot of these ideas under the three dogmas, right? Almost like perfectly, with the second dogma providing the perfect like
Mm.
lead in, right? Being all about adaptation and
Mm.
um, to my amazement, there was no single mention of the word evolution in that
Mm.
paper, despite, adaptation being a central concept. So I basically, over the course of like 2, 3 weeks, I just put together this paper. And as you'll see, this is very much a work in progress. I would welcome feedback and criticism. And yeah, but I don't know. It's just kind of like a line of thought that keeps giving. Like these past week, I've been preparing for this talk, and I feel like a whole lot of new avenues of just different parts of literature that I was completely unaware of keep opening up, which yeah, I find super fulfilling. Hope it's the same for you guys.
Oh yeah, yeah. This is a very conceptually rich area to think about, and as you said, there's a lot to be done here. So, with that, yeah, thanks for the really detailed and rich explanation of your trajectory. Now, I'm very excited to actually just dive into the slides and just see get into the presentation.
Okay, great. Yeah. So yeah, I already gave this little bit of backdrop, I suppose. This was submitted at the Find the Frame workshop organized by, I think, Mark. I don't know if he's here today, and others. And yeah, I suppose I've already said what I needed to say here. I'll just clarify further that this is kind of like a response to that paper that David, Mark, and Anna wrote. It's a conceptual reframe. You can look at it as like a review, a theoretical synthesis of a lot of these parts of the literature and but a bunch of disparate ideas that I think come together quite nicely to address what I consider a bunch of questions that Dave, Mark, and Anna are raising in this wonderful paper. Um, and as I said, I welcome progress. I welcome feedback, and I will very quickly go through the three dogmas, even though it was just last week. And I did read your synopsis of Dave's talk; it was fantastic. I was really glad that you were doing those write-ups. I hadn't seen them before. And like I said, I think the three dogmas are basically laying out a CS problem. I think maybe specifically an RL problem, but I think it's a lot wider than that, actually. Um, and the first dogma being that MDPs and the whole formalism around RL is very much focused on the environment. We don't really have a theory of the agents, right? And in fact, a lot of um, uh, concepts or ideas like reward are misattributed to the environment, as we'll see, and I think as a lot of people here probably recognize, whereas they clearly need to be in the domain of the agent, and a lot of people are acknowledging that and trying to theorize around it, and we'll sort of follow up on some of those ideas. A second dogma was that Ritu focused on learning as finding this terminal solution, right? That there's this start and stop where the optimization process, and that's a sort of key idea, this optimization oriented nature of our concept of learning in writ large, right? Which in RL is really epitomized. And the third one, which I think David, both in the paper and in his talk, tried to warn not to try to soften sort of the harsh connotations that the word dogma comes with, is around the reward hypothesis. And he just encourages going through that bowling paper, encourages the various nuances that are involved in either accepting or rejecting the reward hypothesis, and even interpreting it to begin with, right? Interpreting what we can expect from the statement of the reward hypothesis. And yeah, you're right. I call these tenets in my paper mostly. I mean, it was partly a sort of I just don't have the sort of standing of someone like David Abel, so I didn't want to come off. And I know that there's a lot of sensitivity around these topics. Apparently less so. Like I feel like 3 years ago when I started talking about this stuff in the beginning of my PhD, and I didn't get a lot of a lot of friendly responses. So I think things that may have changed a little bit since then, but so I call them tenets for that reason, but also for also a genuine reason, which is that I don't feel like I'm going to. I don't think this evolutionary perspective I'm going to give is going to completely like dismantle any of these dogmas. In fact, it's going to really incorporate and sort of leave room for some of these interpretations, which have obviously like just proven historically incredibly productive, right? So it's not there's got to be something true about them, right? So and I think just the evolutionary view, I hope will, in my mind at least, it has helped to kind of accept these standing perspectives and the theory and just like extend it to incorporate something that I think Dave and others are pointing to as still missing or begging for some elaboration. And so, like I said, this biological solution, which I think of as the sort of the out from this dead end, so to speak, of this particular paradigm, starts with adaptation. Given that it's evolutionary in nature, I think the idea that the Dave's paper very explicitly offers this adaptive paradigm as an alternative to this terminal search paradigm. And there's this notion of open-ended novelty search work by Ken Stanley and others, who I will refer to extensively in this presentation and the paper I do as well, will basically formalize not in the sense of mathematical formulations, but it will concretize, maybe it's a better word, what we mean by adaptation. I think this was one of the questions that came up when Dave was presenting last week too. Like one of the first questions was, how do we define adaptation, right? I feel like evolutionary adaptation provides exactly one account at least, right, of what we mean by this particular token, right?
Mhm.
And I think adaptation, various issues that I'll raise surrounding the question of adaptation, or at the very least, these biological sort of tricks that make adaptation definitively distinct from terminal search. I think some of us will really start raising or pointing us to questions that are raised by the reward hypothesis. In the Bowling paper, um, they raise they mention a few examples at the end of the paper as to like cases where the axioms fail to be met, right? And I think one of them are when you have these um, multi-objective, multiple objectives that the organism defines in order to, well, not even the organism, like even if you have in a purely artificial setting. But anyways, I just want to sort of highlight that that will be the main thing I'll be talking about in under the reward hypothesis dogma, right? And then I will end, and I think the reward hypothesis, as we also discussed in Dave's presentation last week, um, very closely tied to the first problem, right? Because the question of what agents are is typically goes hand in hand with the question of what goal-directed behavior is, how goal-directed behavior is. Like pretty much, I think everyone, their first intuition, and I think this is more or less formally accepted too in the community, that if you appear as though you're seeking goals, right, then you are an agent, right? And since the reward hypothesis really tells you what goals what the relationship between how goals are defined, right? And that is with respect to reward maximization, then I think the D3 or the reward hypothesis is really making a claim, is like our best attempt, is the current paradigm's attempt at giving a theory of agency. So I think these two can't really be decoupled, right? And I will essentially actually deviate from this evolutionary story. I will still use the example of evolution and define an agent as a entity that is capable of evolutionary adaptation, right? But obviously, just as even Darwin, recognized, evolution is not a theory of origin of life, right? Evolution doesn't say anything about its own bootstrapping or its own origins. So we'll have to seek that a theory, a formal theory of agency elsewhere. And I think thermodynamics and a rich body of work from far from equilibrium statistical mechanics is where that should be sought. And for those who are maybe looking forward to this part most, I should warn you that this is what I will say the least about, partly because I just won't have time, and also, frankly, due to my limitations, my technical knowledge of these far from equilibrium theories, which, despite my biophysics background, I haven't been able to keep up with over the years. So, what do I hope you will? By the way, if anyone wants to interrupt, feel free. Let me also open this laser pointer in case that helps. Yeah. I guess what I'm hoping for you to take away here is first an acknowledgement that evolution is a viable theory of learning, right? That is applicable not just to cross-generational evolution or development, right? That it's perfectly reasonable, plausible at least, I should say, that an evolutionary kind of dynamic can take hold within a lifetime, right? And I think many different people are, some have been long proponents of this, like Zathmary, I'll mention, but even others, I think, are coming around to sort of acknowledge this, and I'll provide some quotes to point you in some of these directions. And the second sort of conceptual takeaway is basically my response to the paper, right, and how this evolutionary view um, can inform the three dogmas. And I will be heavily relying on Ken Stanley's, Lehman and Clune's work on open-ended novelty search. And I hope that that will be sort of that some main ideas. I think I outlined like three main ideas from that literature that I think worth carrying forward. And you can think of them as essentially a modern notion of evolution. I think people think, oh, evolutionary algorithms. I've been there, done that, right? Been around since the 80s, like, or even before, probably, like super simple, not particularly exciting, like, or at least the excitement has really died over the years, it seems. And I feel like this is an invitation to sort of throw out what you think evolutionary strategies are computationally, and just introduce you to some modern algorithms, right, that are used, for example, by Alpha Evolve, right, that comes from the work of Clune, Stanley, and colleagues, that really are proving just practically useful, right, if nothing else. But I think they also provide some conceptual sort of um, Lego pieces that are applicable to beyond just super pragmatic reasons. They kind of provide these tools to reconceptualize and build a new paradigm out of, so to speak. And before I used to, I think the paper still, I kind of pitched this as implications of this evolutionary view for RL and AI more broadly. And I think out of the discussion last week, one of the nice takeaways from you was that really what paradigm shifts, which is, in Kuhn's vocabulary, which I think Dave and others use in their paper too. What they really do is they offer you novel affordances, right? You can like approach old problems with some wiggle room that you didn't have before. And I think some of those central problems in RL and AI more broadly are that of explore exploit, right, which is a fundamental problem that keeps popping up, and that of resource rational decision making, which, as I alluded to in the introduction, given my interest in sort of metabolism information, I think, and this is a growing area, right, of work in RL, both in the computational realm, but also in sort of in application to human decision making and whatnot. And I think this could really gain some new traction, at least some new directions of attack, sort of with this evolution point of view. And one thing which I don't have mentioned in the paper, at least like the last sentence, I make a very vague reference to it, but it came up again and again last time. And in last meeting, I want to spend some time on it, mostly as a discussion topic, but I'll also have a couple of slides on it, is that of representational learning, right? So we kind of talked about how a lot of um, uh, agency, I don't remember the exact sort of framing that came up during the talk last week, but just this acknowledgement, I think, was in the context of when we talk about memory, right? Memory as representations and as providing sort of this template to for an agent to base its actions on. I want to talk a little bit about that. And finally, I do want to, and I really debated as to whether this should be earlier in the talk, but I feel like there is just a lot of um, curiosity, right, as to how it's possible to do evolution within a lifetime, right? And there are a lot of different sort of ideas around this, and I will touch on one of them by Zathmary that I am quite fond of, called Darwinian neurodynamics. One particular implementation of that idea. So, so on with the first topic, which is really the main takeaway. Really, if there's one thing you want to take away, is this, that there are really two fundamental models of learning, right? And Dragoi calls this the selectionist model and the instructional model. Obviously, the selectionist model is sort of the evolutionary model, right? And the instructional model is what we typically think of as RL, or supervised learning. And even unsupervised learning, I would argue, in many settings. At least how we use the term unsupervised, I feel like applies, also falls under the instructional model. But the idea of the selectionist model is that there is a generation of a bunch of variants, right? Some of which happen to exhibit this fittedness, which you can define in different ways, but essentially it's by definition the property that it will linger around, or it'll duplicate, it'll proliferate, right? That's the selection process, right? Um, but what's important about this selectionist model, the evolutionary model, is that um, uh, even if you do, sorry, go ahead, Sanj. Eli, sorry.
Oh, so could we understand the selectionist model of learning as basically constrained maximum entropy?
Constrained maximum entropy. So I don't know if there is. I'm not familiar with that term, but I can
Okay,
imagine
so
what
like
you're trying to say by that. Right? There's
basically
max.
randomly vary in all the dimensions that still allow you to pass the selection test.
Yeah. I would say you're actually kind of foreshadowing this notion of open-endedness, right?
Okay,
By
okay.
highlighting this idea that, as you say, variation across an unlimited number of dimensions, right? Feature dimensions, so to speak, right? And I think, yeah, you're absolutely right to kind of highlight that aspect as being central to the selectionist model. And maybe even more broadly speaking, what is, a lot of people think, oh, the typical argument, which I think I'll elaborate on the next slide, is, oh, but there's a fitness function. The fitness function is your reward function, is your objective. That's what you're trying to sort of climb on, right? And I think that is, there's definitely selection on fitness, and there's some aspects of evolutionary development that can be, in fact, have been very formally shown to be equivalent to SGD, stochastic gradient descent. But I'm arguing, and I think there's a distinction between the old evolutionary sort of computational models and new evolutionary computational models, that it's more than that, right? And you're really missing something by focusing on the fitness selection part, which is sort of this latter part, which really dismisses or doesn't give much credence to the power of a good variation generation model, right? Or that step in the process, right? And the fact that that part is non-teleological, right? You're not being pulled towards a particular optimum, right? Um, and so, and the instruction model, I think you already have a good intuition for me. For me, the sort of this idea of the smart mattress is kind of embodies it, or this idea that there's this molding process, there's this constant interaction between the target and your learning system, which in this case is a mattress, and it just molds that. Go ahead, Kier.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Um, I'm somewhat wondering, would a sort of generative adversarial network where you're kind of doing the let's say the molding part, but you're sort of your criterion is evolving too. So like the adversary is also evolving. I'm curious if you would put that closer to the selectionist or closer to the instructional model, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a very good question. So I don't have too much experience with these GANs, but I would say that based on my understanding, there's still very much an objective that's being optimized, both for the discriminator as well as the generator, right? So there is this back propagation um, of error. There's a signal, right, that finds its way back to the mechanics of either the generative process or the discriminative process. So I would put even that under sort of this instructional model. I would say that that lacks this true open-endedness that I'll discuss being introduced by Ken Stanley and others. But you're pointing to an important insight in that I feel like a lot of approaches. This is also true. Actually forgot to include slides on this whole question of intrinsic motivation, right? And there's a huge intrinsic motivation literature out there, sort of coming up with objectives, like these auxiliary objectives that try to maximize. I mean, I suppose empowerment is one of the more popular ones in this group, perhaps. But ultimately, these are still objectives, right? You can write them down. You know what sort of you're trying to the peak of the hill that you're trying to seek. So I would say that those still fall in the instructional regime. Zach?
Yes. So just to clarify, is the main difference between the selectionist and instructional model simply that the target is static in the selectionist, whereas it's dynamic and responsive to the agent in the instructional? That kind of the idea?
Um, yeah, so there is definitely like in the previous question, like there's something being captured by GANs, right? Which, as you say, is like this dynamic sort of bootstrapping, like one the target keeps shifting, right? As the discriminator tries to as soon as the discriminator solves the last problem, the problem changes, right? And there's definitely this is what I will be talking about under the topic of coevolution, which is one of those three main ideas, I think from this open-ended novelty search literature. And I think that idea is perfectly captured by GANs, and I think at the core of it is, you're right, this like dynamic. I think of this bootstrapping. Maybe that's not the right term, but like you say, just this moving of the target, right? Constant moving of the target, right? And yeah, so there's for sure this important element of that in coevolution, in the evolutionary context, at least. Alec?
One sec. Yeah, I'd like also to mention one more paradigm, which I think hasn't been mentioned before, is diffusion. Because evolution, we are kind of think like jumps around, and diffusion is like a drift, which is also very biologically motivated, right? So, and there's been interesting work by Michael Levin about a combination of diffusion and evolution, but I actually even expand on that work because we think like of diffusion like classical AI-based diffusion, which is one end, movement from total chaos to the image or vice versa. But in fact, in nature, there is drift both ways. There is concurrent creation and destruction. And when we think about diffusion, I think that like AI diffusion should be generalized more in this way, because you also want to be prepared for next. You don't want to overfit to the environment. I think you need to think about diffusion and like kind of form of exploration, but you want to be prepared for next catastrophic shift of the environment. So both are drifts, like you, like as an organism drifting, and the environment is drifting. So that I think it's another current paradigm that we kind of need to think of.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I do reference some work on drift. Drift is, genetic drift has a long history in biology, and I think I did cite a couple of papers. I actually don't remember them off the top of my head. I totally agree that um, you can talk about this in diffusion. Perhaps you can operationalize it using these diffusion models that are out there. Again, I don't have much experience with the diffusion models, and so I won't speculate on what that would look like. If you have any more ideas, perhaps as I sort of show some of these, I mean, explicitly, Stanley and colleagues do talk about this generative part as a diffusive process, right? And the question really becomes, how do you operationalize that, right? How do you encourage this without falling into the trap of imposing this predetermined objective function, right? That as soon as you do that, you've kind of denied what we would consider truly open-ended, undirected exploration, if you want to use sort of terms from RL literature. Did you want to say something more, Alec?
Well, it's another thing, it's unrelated. I had this kind of idea about what we are talking here about. Sorry, maybe not exactly within this your line of current plan of presentation, but I just had the thought, like trying to generalize the zeitgeist that we are having today. We are talking about representation learning, but the whole thing about we are still constrained. Like on the one hand, we are constrained by human inductive biases. When we look at what nature creates, it's mind-boggling. It's constrained by like physical biases. We create a new reality, but in a way, we could think like we are a continuation of this evolutionary process, where like we had self-reflection and a kind of structured but human inductive biases. But another paradigm that was very productive is like deep learning, but it's a kind of also reservoir computing, kind of the same thing, but it was also in the context of only feature learning. But now I think we could expand it to all modes of learning, not like feature learning for representation learning, but also architecture learning and design learning, and like going like this grand pronouncement. We could like think like about like deep learning manifesto, new deep learning, where we would apply it to everything. We could improve an evolution, not just learning about feature representation, deep learning of architecture, deep learning of agent stuff, and deep learning like uh, even if you think about like paradigm of reinforcement learning, we kind of think like agent versus environment, but agent is unstructured. The moment we think about structured agent, we kind of introduce our human biases, but our human models, which is the nature only was able to create a model kind of in two ways. One is like through us humans, which are like in direct nature, create a model and could introspect and do self-reflection. I'm not a philosopher, but it would be good to have a philosophical background to kind of to think about a more generic way, like metaphysical kind of approach. But also in terms of but another interesting thing, nature has only one way to create a model, like using this, genomics and a kind of structured development paradigm. And we know that a kind of an individual development of organism, a kind of recreates evolutional story, which is an interesting thing, right? So nature can kind of do kind of self-reflection. So actually, we could do the better than nature, being a part of nature ourselves, because some natural development are constrained to hardware and can transcend certain paths because like very low probability or even like physically impossible. But with our flight of fancy, we could even overcome this, and because we could do it in a kind of impossible, physically impossible model. So that's another interesting, I think.
Yeah, the main thing I'll pick up on is definitely the representation learning, and you specifically mentioned architecture search, right? And I think that has been actually one of the more historically, actually, Ken Stanley and sort of these folks in the open-ended novelty search literature, they were interested in these algorithms to perform architecture search, right? Again, sort of following these insights from evolution and development, which I'll talk about on exactly under that umbrella or under that topic of representational learning and sort of the new affordances on that front. But I'll just move on because I think I'm fairly behind. Let me just see 10:46. Yes, I should definitely go faster here. So I think I already sort of anticipated this question, this criticism that often comes up. Isn't fitness just a reward as a supervision signal? And I already said that, yes, but it detracts from this mechanism for open-ended diversity generation, right? And also that it still falls into this notion of optimization, right, rather than satisficing. And I'll tell you what that, I mean, you probably heard that term before, and I'll give you the quote where that comes from. And also that there's a certain notion of selection that actually is not gradient based, not involve, it's non-objective, as Stanley and colleagues call it, right? And this, I think, quote, I will bring this up again and again and again during this talk, and I think it really captures the core of what it is about this distinction between the selectionist model, the evolutionary model, and the instructional model. And this is from Herbert Simon, where he says, however adaptive the behavior of organisms in learning and choice situations, this adaptiveness falls far short of the ideal of maximizing postulated in economic theory, right? I think he's specifically referring to the von Neumann-Morgenstern axioms that the four that Dave also went through. But evidently, organisms adapt well enough to satisfy. They do not, in general, optimize, right? So this idea of satisficing is that it satisfies to suffice, right? And just meets a bare minimum threshold beyond which anything goes, so to speak. And so that is the core idea. Again, we'll be revisiting. And the other idea, which again I've alluded to before, is the sort of criticism that people often raise is that, well, sure, evolution is fine, open-ended or not, but we're talking about brains, we're talking about learning during a lifetime, right? What does this have to do with that, right? How does this have any explanatory power there? And I will just the shortest answer is adaptive immune system, right? So your adaptive immune system is already performing an evolutionary process, right, to generate the antibodies to novel antigens that not only you haven't never seen in your life, but your ancestors have never seen, right? And so this was in fact the idea that when one of the sort of main proponents of neural Darwinism, as it was called, was a Nobel Prize winner in the discovery of precisely this process or important aspects of this process. And so it's no surprise that people, once they realize that evolution can take place within the lifetime, right, within the lifetime of an organism, that perhaps there are mechanisms by which the brain too can benefit from these evolutionary mechanisms. And I apologize about the sound of the piano tuning. I don't know if you guys can hear it. I hope it gets filtered out, but long story, I couldn't do anything about it. So I was really surprised to see that Neil Bramley, actually, who I think, you know, a lot of cognitive scientists, I think neuroscientists are maybe, actually, I don't know if that's true. Maybe I shouldn't say that. I was going to say that neuroscience are maybe more open to these evolutionary modes of mechanisms of learning, but I don't know if that's necessarily true either. But and so I'll just read this quote just to kind of indicate that this idea isn't as foreign or crazy as you might think it is. And he's basically highlighting again what I just mentioned, which is that the that evolution can operate within the lifetime too. So he says when it comes to individual higher level cognition, we habitually think of minds as doing something far cleverer, with more goal directedness and foresight than the random walk of evolution. Minds are thought to encode a hierarchical causal generative model of their environment. The generative model framework also seems to capture an important sense in which the mind seems set up to produce stochastic variation and novelty of the sort that could allow for evolutionary mechanisms, right? And again, we also see sort of this hint or pointer towards both the notion of representational learning as sort of where these generative models of the environment being the representations of the environment essentially, and this notion of drift that came up, right? The random walk of evolution diffusion. And again, so this is Gerald Edelman, the Nobel Prize winner in immunology, who coined this term neo-Darwinism. It really fell out of favor, right, since the 70s, 80s. I don't think it was picked up upon. I don't know the exact historical sort of contingencies that played a role. I suspect that as we learn more and more about the brain, plasticity mechanisms, etc., it just seemed less and less necessary to invoke such a radical idea of random generation and selection within the brain. Also, I think a lot of his ideas, I'm not too familiar with them, but I think a lot of them relied on physiological sort of requirements that are just not necessarily true. For example, a really prolific birth and death of neuronal cells in the brain, which we know to be mostly not true. But since then, others have picked up on mutants of that idea, you can say. And I think the most important one, the one that I've seen the most published on, is proposed by Erich Zatmary, who calls it Darwinian neurodynamics precisely to distinguish it from neurodarwinism as sort of trappings, the requirements that you have this variation generation selection acting on actual like cells or units in the brain, and instead they are more a proponent. They have various different plausible mechanisms that they offer hypotheses. But one of my favorite ones, and I think one that will appeal more to this crowd, is this idea that the individual units of selection, right, that gets duplicated, mutated, and proliferated is actually a neural, a dynamical pattern, right, that a set of neurons, a network of neurons generates. And later on, this is what I was saying, I wasn't sure if I should put that explanation here or later on. I feel like it is somewhat orthogonal to the main arguments of the three dogmas. And so I put it later on, but hopefully we can revisit it as to what the mechanics of such a model actually look like. Okay, so now down to the three dogmas, right? So the second dogma, as I said, we'll start with the second one, is that learning is not terminal search, but or the dogma is that learning is terminal search, and the alternative paradigm is that it is adaptive, right? And as I have mentioned several times now, the definition of adaptation, I think evolution really sort of endows us with, is this idea of fitness optimization, which is typically what's really super emphasized, overemphasized perhaps. But what the other side of the evolutionary sort of coin is open-ended novelty search. And this is the idea that I think was developed by Lehman, Stanley, Clune, and others, colleagues throughout the years since I think the early 2000s or mid 2000s. And I would like to, this is over many different sort of publications, and many different ideas appear with many different names, but I'd like to highlight three of these main ideas, right? And that essentially, for me, are the requirements or prerequisites for making the evolutionary process or computation an open-ended one. And the first one is what they call speciation or niching. If you're a biologist, there's a real difference between niching and speciation, which they sort of gloss over. This is more like taking inspiration from these ideas from biology and just trying to operationalize it. And I really like this quote, which really gets to the bottom of what niching is. And I think really at the end of the day, this idea out of all these three is the most important one in trying to wrap your head around a process that is what it means to have a process that is non-objective, right? And gradient free and open-ended. So what they say is grass does not preclude grasshoppers, nor do bacteria compete directly with bears. Instead, competition is restricted and often localized within the niche. Evolution produces diversity, not a single optimum, right? And the way I tried to visualize this here, and they do specifically like algorithmically, computationally, uh, talk about these archives, right, which are basically these grids which they organize across typically different behavioral or structural features of the organism that they evolve, right? And what they observe is that there should be little or no or little selective pressure on organisms, on novel of organisms that break into a novel niche, right? That is either previously unoccupied or is not. Um, let's just say that it's previously unoccupied, right? And just to emphasize the true nature of novelty generation in these algorithms, right? And really, like that really boils down to essentially again, they go through various iterations of different algorithms that perform this, starting with super computationally expensive ones that require clustering of behavioral features and sort of trying to avoid those clusters, right? But later on, they come up with less computation intensive ones, one of which being map elites, which I think was developed by Clune. Mapping elites here, which essentially does a little bit of both of these, right? So it does some fitness optimization within a niche, right? But at the same time tries to advocate. And this is where the vocabulary gets tricky, right? Because the word advocate has this teleological and directed nature to it, right? But really, it's this idea of I think of it, and I think I have this, I definitely do have a slide on this later on. I think of it as a divergent as opposed to a convergent process. Right? Optimization is this process that you literally have this like potential function that you're performing minimization on, right? Gradient descent on, whereas and therefore finding sort of these stable, steady states, right, in there that you converge to. Whereas these open-ended processes are these the steady states or these sort of pseudo steady states that are divergent, right? All the gradients actually look or point away from that point. That's precisely trying to get away from a given point. And I think I will, and I already mentioned that MapElites is what's used in Alpha Evolve as well. But I really want to actually, since I mentioned this like convergent versus divergence distinction, I do want to jump to that slide where I try to sort of visually make that a bit more accessible, right? By essentially showing this contrast between Dave's sort of representation of this convergent terminal search process, right? Which leads to oftentimes a single optimal solution, whereas this divergent process where your landscape, your signal, if you want to think of these algorithms as still providing some kind of signal to the variation introducing process, are pointing away, right, to a whole bunch of new possibilities, right, which are satisficing, right, and that if they meet a minimal criteria of survival to duplicate, right, that is good enough, and that is marked as a successful instance in a phylogeny of variance, right? And again, I hope this contrast is clear enough. And if you have any questions, I can maybe try and I've been rushing through, worried about time, so I was a bit too careless with introducing some of these ideas. If there are any clarifying questions I could answer, let me know.
I have a question, but it's trying to I'm trying to actually reconcile what you're saying, which makes a lot of sense. Um, gradient-free optimization or like non-optimization or something that occurs without any objective attached to it. That makes a lot of sense. I don't think we should insist everything is just gradient descent. However, I wanted to ask if you can relate what you're saying to this replicator equation, which is a deterministic equation in evolutionary game theory, and it has a stable attractor point, which is called the evolutionary stable strategy. And that dynamics can be actually represented as gradient descent on some KL divergence between two distributions. So do you think that both these perspectives could be true, or how would you relate what you're saying to that replicator equation?
I have to admit ignorance. I don't know anything about the replicator equation. Can you say a little bit more about it?
Yeah, so it's just a formula that says, how the frequencies of different strategies or types or like, populations in a population change over time based on their relative fitness. So fitness here becomes a very important quantity that enters this. And there's a paper that I can send to you later. It's from John Baez, 2021 or something. And he shows that this replicator equation can be, it can be shown that the dynamics follows the gradients of some KL divergence between some evolutionary stable state distribution and the population distribution that is constructed from their relative frequencies. So that is a particular like specific example in evolutionary theory that is both has a fixed attractor point as its final convergence point, as well as it can be represented as gradient descent on something. So yeah, I guess I'm just trying to say that there exists some even within evolutionary theory those things exist, and it would be interesting to try and
Yeah.
reconcile what you're saying with that.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I suppose the best I can do on this is just to highlight this point that I mentioned earlier, right? That evolution is both, right? Evolutionary adaptation definitely has components of fitness optimization, right?
Mhm.
Which, according to this conceptualization, happens within a niche, right?
Mhm.
Not across niches. Um, and that is definitely that is an objective based, it has minima and perhaps can be described with these descriptive models like the ones that you're talking about, right?
Mhm.
And like I said, I think the value of this open-ended novelty search approach is that it acknowledges this additional sort of engine,
Mhm.
right? That drives evolution, and that is less is overshadowed by our eagerness um, uh, to view everything through the optimization lens, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think this is why I keep like bringing up this quote again and again, right, to distinguish between like the satisficing versus optimization point of view.
Mhm.
And I definitely, I guess you're asking for reconciliation, and I'm just saying that, yeah, that reconciliation is already baked in. There is certainly fitness optimization. And in fact, this algorithm that I mentioned here, mapping elites, it's a so-called quality diversity algorithm. They refer to these general class of algorithms, quality diversity, quality meaning fitness, right? And diversity meaning this expansion across this open grid, right? Which has no end to its axes, right?
Mhm.
It's unbounded, right?
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, they apply these to a bunch of different settings. And one of the earlier applications is these actual like physical entities with geometric shapes, and just show that you get both diversity and fitness, right? This is an interesting thing, right? This is that it's not that we are seeking novelty for the sake of novelty alone, right? But by opening up the directions, trajectories that your system can pursue. This maybe you can construe this as improved exploration mechanism. You actually do end up finding better, like fitter entities, right? just on an
Yeah,
absolute
to
scale.
me, this sounds like you're trying to emphasize this important underlying mechanism of diversification that has been overlooked because we're simply mostly fixated on just optimizing the thing without thinking
Exactly.
about how it's done.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And what I was trying to, one of the main takeaways, I think, from this literature, 20 years or so literature, is that they identified these three very specific and super simple, like when the rubber meets the road, these are very simple things to implement, right? Niching is as simple as coming up with a way of quantifying your some features, which, for example, here is the number of voxels that were filled and the density of the bones, which are properties of the actual creatures that they evolve, right? And they just try to make sure that niching algorithm, and again, this varies throughout the literature, but the mapping elites one, I actually forget what the mapping elites one does exactly, but it's definitely not using these expensive clustering algorithms, right? Um, but this is just one out of three ways that in in my mind, they've encouraged that correcting that bias, right? And the second one, just to go through it very quickly, is the coevolution, which I mentioned earlier. And I think this got some traction in the RL literature when it came out. This algorithm called POET, which is this open-ended trailblazer, and the paired aspect just referring to the fact that the dynamics of both the environment, like the environment actually gets a genome too, essentially, right? If you can think of it that way, right? The environment has a genome just like the agent does, and it's subject to this essentially a self, what do they call it? Like a self-progressing curriculum, right? Where as that bootstrapping that I was talking about earlier on, as the um, uh, once the organism, the agent solves a simpler problem, the problem itself evolves into a more difficult one, right? Um, and again, just want to emphasize that openness of the phenotypes of both the agent and the environment here, making it interesting, right? There's all these co-evolutionary dynamics that arise that are surprising. Again, like not just because they create a whole range of interesting looking agents and environments, but also because they produce fitter agents, right, by your very objective driven measures of performance, right? Um, and the last one is this idea of minimal criterion, right? And again, this I think quote emphasizes the contrast here with standard evolutionary strategies, which is that um, no fitness function or method of quantifying and comparing solution quality exists in these minimal criteria strategies. Instead, individuals are required to satisfy a simple binary minimal criterion to produce and propagate their lineage, right? Again, like super simple from an operational point of view. It's just you're not propagating this difference between the desired objective reward or fitness and what you actually are. Just as long as um, uh, the entity, the creature satisfies a very minimal criteria for duplication, it's good enough. And they see all sorts of they see this as a useful way of maximizing that diversity generation, right? And yeah, so this was my attempt to. I came up with this last night, so I haven't really. I was excited when I thought about it, and I feel like there's something to it, and maybe beyond just a metaphor, right? In that there is something about these dynamical systems that have these fixed points that just reach equilibrium, and they very much the step towards formalizing this notion of terminal um, convergence, right? And in fact, when later on we talk about thermodynamics and far from equilibrium thermodynamics, these are systems, dissipative systems are marked by this constant drive, being constantly driven away from these equilibrium points, right? And so maybe there's something to be pursued here, which is more than just a sort of intuition pump. Okay, so what's the time? 11:11. Okay, so it's not too bad, I guess. So I will jump to the next dogma, which is dogma number 3, the reward hypothesis, right? Um, and so the reward hypothesis being that all goals can be thought of in terms of reward maximization, right? And like I said earlier, what I'll be talking about most in the evolutionary biological context is sort of this issue of multi-objective versus scalar objective, which is brought up both in the Bowling paper, right? Specifically as one of these instances where the axioms fail, right? But also, and this is actually what I will start with, is this notion of objective versus non-objective goals, right? So this idea that there's actually, when we say all goals, I think I'm suggesting that we can distinguish between two types of goals. Those that have objectives, right? Like we were talking about in these quality diversity algorithms, the quality parts, the fitness part does have an objective that you're converging towards, that you're optimizing as we imagine optimization to be done in most of AI. But there's also this non-objective search process, which let's call it the novelty search mechanism, right? And you're right, it's so hard to avoid the word optimization. It's like it really provides you a hint, gives you a hint as to how deeply ingrained it is in how we view the world. And I think search has a more neutral association with it, right? Like, and so I think, and also it's nice that novelty search people use the word search to describe their open-ended algorithms. So there's that confluence there as well. And again, like this term non-objective is not something that I came up with. A lot of these papers by Ken Stanley and others, and very much rely on this terminology. And I think it was most sort of popularly and rhetorically sort of communicated through this subtitle, right? The myth of the objective, right? This idea that there's a kind of search that is worthy of pursuit, which is not simply by pursuit of an objective. And I suppose this is just like I'm constantly trying to anticipate criticism. And I suppose one criticism may be that you're just simply reinventing this distinction between direct and indirect exploration. That is sort of how people talk about exploration in RL, right? And that there's something very unappealing about undirected exploration, which seems to be what is being motivated here, right? But I suppose in response to that, I would point to those 3 techniques, right, that Ken Stanley and colleague come up with, which are not simply random, throwing a shot randomly in the dark, right? In the way like a true undirected exploratory mechanism in RL does, right? Just sampling. In fact, this is one of the controls in many of the papers, right? They compare random sampling with these novelty search, whether it's minimal criteria, a niching, or coevolution. That's often one of the controls that they use, which is just random sampling of the space of all possible phenotypes, for example, right? And so I should probably make that distinction clear as well, right? Just non-objective search does not mean necessarily just random search either, right? There's this sort of nuance there to be acknowledged. And the question is, okay, well, like, where does this objective non-objective issue, where does this fall in that analogy that Dave gave in his last presentation? And I think it's really the first door, so to speak, that he introduced, right? And this notion that a goal or purpose is a preference on outcomes. Right? I think this is not a rigorous, obviously, mathematical proof, but I think just following the idea of niching, right, and the existence of these multiple solutions, right, simultaneously, is indicative of the fact that there is no preference relation, right, implied in a open-ended evolutionary search process, right? That going back to that slide that I had early on, that a grass doesn't, the presence of a very fit grass doesn't preclude the coexistence of a very fit grasshopper, right? Um, and this is and this is what I won't um, spend too much more time on this. It's more like an intuition. I wish Dave was here to sort of reflect on it. I think the axioms of completeness and independence are the ones that are most that this idea is most vulnerable to, right? Um, that um, or maybe just let's say completeness, because as I said during the talk last week, I still struggle with the independence axiom quite a bit. But simply this idea that there's a clear preference relation, right, between two organisms and their fitness value is just simply it's just a oversimplification that doesn't exist in the evolutionary context. But what I do want to spend a little bit more time on, because I can just rely on the bowling text directly, is that this multi-dimensional MDPs, reward functions, are uh, shown to be strictly more expressive than scalar reward functions. It's just, as far as I understand, it's Mura's results where just theoretically, these are just known to be far more expressive, right? And furthermore, that Bowling et al. Show that this expressivity comes at the cost of violating at least one of the axioms, right? So I'm just sort of taking that as a given, right? And asking where does evolution and biological fitness optimization, if you even want to think about it just in purely optimization terms, fall in the multidimensionality, multi-objectivity spectrum, right? Scalar versus vector, right? And both from purely computational work, right? This is Delberg's work on multiple selves, essentially showing that having these multiple, these vector valued reward signals is um, um, it works, right? You just get better learning agents. And on more like theoretical psychological end of the spectrum, there's a whole slew um, of papers that actually try to seek the answer to a question that we'll be coming back to, which is where does reward or value come from originally? So the origins of reward question, which, as we discussed in the last talk with Dave, I think is very closely tied to this question of reward hypothesis, but also ties the third dogma to the first dogma, which is the question of where the model for agency, right? So I'll just read this quote from this paper by Summerfield. Most RL models assume that a value is a unidimensional quantity. Although multi-objective RL models relax this assumption, this seems incongruous when considering that challenges that animals face in natural environments, which involve jointly satisfying many different constraints. For example, maintaining levels of satiety, I don't know how to pronounce that, hydration, warmth, and social capital, right? Satiety. Anyways, so these so-called drive theories of motivation, right? Many of them end up acknowledging that in biology, it's actually much more, just again, an empirical observation that despite the, I think it was Michael who brought up the dopamine as the singular scalar currency in um, in brains, right? But even there, right, there's this remarkable first line in the abstract of this paper by, oh yeah, I put it here, by Rachel Lee and Michael Daw and Nathaniel Daw, that says the hypothesis that midbrain dopamine neurons broadcast a reward prediction error is among the great successes of computational neuroscience. However, recent results contradict the core aspect of this theory, specifically that the neurons convey scalar homogeneous signal, right? And there's a lot of nuance to be unpacked here. And I'm not super familiar with this article. I didn't cite this in my paper. I definitely should. But just because there is a singular molecular messenger, right, does not mean that the signal is um, is scalar, right? That there is this collapsing of all of the reward signals emanating from various biological sources, like like the ones that was mentioned in the other quote, the warmth, hydration, etc. These don't necessarily get collapsed, right? Even if dopamine ends up being the um, molecule that captures sort of the urgency signal that is communicated for each one of these drives or needs. Um,
So I
and
just wanted to add, so in addition to this heterogeneity that you're discussing here, there's also, heavy debate in neuroscience that dopamine neurons do not solely represent rewards, but they also capture movement. Like, for example, if you
yeah,
carefully measure kinematics of motion in mice, like the acceleration or like how vigorously they start licking and so on, there are some dopamine neurons in certain parts of the brain that do not capture reward at all. They capture those kinematics of motion. So I think one thing that I remember I forgot to mention, I think Michael's perspective that he suggested dopamine is this kind of kind of like universal currency that the brain uses. I think that's actually contested in many fronts. I don't think it's that simple at all.
yeah, yeah, and I suppose up until recently, I just assumed that it's still very much the case that on the physiological neuroscience front, that the scalar hypothesis is very much king. But again, these papers I did not cite in my original paper, and I definitely should. There is certainly, as you say, there's much more nuance, and there's much more. It's not as clear cut. And I see Dave is here now. Okay, great. Go ahead, Dave.
Hey, Monty. Yeah, so sorry I had to miss the beginning because of the daylight savings,
No worries.
unfortunately. But yeah, glad to be here now. So I just had a quick clarifying question about how you're thinking about some of these questions regarding goals with, say, multi-objective as opposed to scalars. So we can differentiate maybe between the sort of breadcrumbs that are used to incentivize, say, learning or decision making in a vast kind of complex world. So it's saying the open-endedness case, it's really hard to learn the right things. So we might have some signal to kind of point agents in the right direction. And whether that signal is scalar or multidimensional can shape the learning dynamics to maybe get that outward spiral you drew, as opposed to, say, converge to a point. But then there's separately the question of what is our account of what a goal is to begin with? Is it to maximize this scalar or to kind of achieve a point on the Pareto frontier? And I
Mhm.
can imagine, kind of given a Pareto frontier, you could still give an agent scalar breadcrumbs to find the right point, or given a scalar goal, you could give an agent multi-criteria breadcrumbs. I'm curious if you have thoughts on like which of the two are you most interested in? Is it more what is the
Mhm.
account of goals or the account of breadcrumbs?
Yeah, it's interesting the use of the word breadcrumbs. I wonder if this will answer that question. This is my sense. This is how I see what I think you're calling the breadcrumb versus the ultimate, what I call the terminal goal, right? So I distinguish between the instrumental goals and terminal goals, right? And the instrumental goals are the ones that are kind of the ones that you're familiar with, right? The ones that underpin these um, uh, parallel circuitries, right? That emanate uh, from physiological needs, right? Hydration can be one of them, fat consumption, protein consumption, whatever the various different needs are. You can imagine them being mediated or their acquisition, right? The drive towards them, that whatever mechanisms which animate the organism to seek them, right? Can be very much captured by these optimizing convergent processes, right? That a lot of people in the homeostatic RL field, I think, have tried to sort of reconcile the reward signal and these distances from these set points, right? Um, And I think this is what you mean by the breadcrumbs. I'm not sure. I would probably say that this is what you're referring to there. And uh, and as I said earlier, and we'll talk about more, I think the question of agency really boils down to the question of where do rewards come from, right? And I the question of where do instrumental goals come from, right? I think the typical answer, like every paper, whether it's these homeostatic RL papers or otherwise, as I'll mention a couple of them, they basically defer to evolution, right? But what I've been trying to argue, I think, from the early slides, is that evolution, especially this latter part of the second side of the coin of evolution, right, which is this open-ended novelty, diversity generation, right? That first of all, that we should construe that as a goal, even though we want to avoid the teleological nature of it, or like the teleological connotations that the term goal carries. But nevertheless, it's a driving force. I don't know. It's really hard to avoid terminology that sidesteps these teleological connotation. But um, a I consider the ultimate sort of source of those breadcrumbs, where the breadcrumbs are actually coming from or leading to be this tendency, this dynamic, right? And that will be what I'll talk about in the under the first dogma. Does that answer your question? I know that wasn't very
Absolutely.
satisfying.
Yeah. Thanks, Moni. Yeah,
Okay.
instrumental goals is exactly what I was after with breadcrumbs. That's perfect.
Okay.
Thank
Okay. And yeah, the only sort of concession I'm asking the established sort of theories to make is that there are multiple of these, and I think both in your paper and the Bowling paper and others, as I've also mentioned, these more recent empirical neuroscientific evidence points to, this is maybe not as un um, uh, as what's the word? Controversial as maybe it once were. But like I said, this begs the question, and I think a lot of people in the homeostatic RL field were actually grappling with this question, right? Which is, where does this reward signal in RL come from, right? And so this very influential paper by Karamati and Gutkin says that theories of conditioning are founded on the argument that animals seek reward, while reward may be defined, at least in the behaviorist approach, as what animals seek. This apparently circular argument relies on the hypothetical and out-of-reach axiom of reward maximization as a behavioral objective of animals. Physiological stability, however, is an observable fact. Right? So, and I think Summerfield phrases this even more clearly as the reward paradox, so again, pointing to the circularity that Karamati also highlights, is that there are frameworks offers a useful set of computational tools for understanding animal learning and behavior. However, as a theory of biological intelligence, it has a major shortcoming that often goes unacknowledged. It is unclear who designs the external reward function against which behavior is optimized. In machine learning, the reward function is an RL model. For an RL model is hand designed by the researcher, right? So this is, I wish I had also included some quotations where they explicitly sort of defer to evolution, right? There's plenty of them, I assure you, where ultimately when so usually at the end of the paper, there's this referral to evolution as ultimately defining what those physiological stable points are, the set points in the language of a lot of these homeostatic or allostatic RL papers. But and in a way, this goes way back to this paper by Singh, Lewis, and Bardo, which is called "Where Do Rewards Come From?" And they sort of attempt to correct this misunderstanding that has been spread so rapidly in RL cycles, which is that this idea that this notion that reward is a property or is endowed by the environment onto the agent, right? And try to correct that by saying that no, actually, the reward is an internal intrinsic property, or it's intrinsic signal generated by the agent itself, right? This only thing that's exchanged between the environment and the agent are the sensory stimuli and the actions. But again, my argument here is that all of these uh, ultimately defer to evolution, right? And that's ultimately what, and I suppose it's, I think this is, again, partly why I wanted to really emphasize this evolutionary versus instructional point of view and paint a picture of evolution that's a bit more complex than this super simple idea we have of natural selection, right? Much richer picture that um, begs for an explanatory mechanism of evolution itself, right? It's like yeah, I don't think it's sufficient to stop there and just say, oh, evolution did it, right? I think there is something productive out of the exercise of trying to ask, how does an evolutionary process come to be, right? Um, and and yeah, so this is, and I suppose maybe this is kind of what again, to go back to your breadcrumbs point, right? I feel like, if you said that, okay, we try to flesh out the third dogma of the reward hypothesis and understand the relationship between goals and rewards, right? And we said that, okay, so these instrumental goals, maybe they can be conceived of using the standard notion of scalar signals, even if you don't want to submit to notion of vector rewards. But ultimately, their origins is deferred to evolution, right? And evolution is the thing that we attributed to the terminal goals, right? And my argument is that for a theory of rare agency and sort of this ultimate open-ended goal-seeking behavior comes from, you need to ground that in whatever it is that yields evolution as a physical process, right? And another way to put this is, I think Dennett put it nicely, is that now there are cells. There was a time millions of billions of years ago when there were none, right? At least none on this planet. So there has to be, as a matter of logic, a true story to be told about how there came to be creatures with cells. And I think if you just replace cells with things that can evolve, right? It really, this is what my argument boils down to, right? That we cannot, that there is an explanation here to be made, right? And uh, and this explanation, as I will briefly just sketch, I think is has to be rooted in the second law of thermodynamics. It's necessarily a thermodynamic theory. There's a rich literature on this, obviously, many years. And I think the challenge here is that, again, the same challenge that we faced earlier on when we looked at evolutionary theories as uh, merely constrained to these cross-generational theories of like speciation and whatnot, right? But if we understand evolution as something that can take place in many different physical substrates, including brains, right? Then the question of how such an evolutionary process can come about, writ more abstractly, right, um, can point to uh, can point to the an answer, at least the beginning of an answer to the D1 question, right? Formal theory of agency, right? Because I hope I have convinced you that this uh, terminal goal-seeking behavior, right, is equivalent to what I've been trying to describe as this open-ended evolutionary process, right? Um, and yeah, so I won't go into this. And this is again something that, as I mentioned earlier, Darwin himself, acknowledged that an evolutionary theory isn't where the buck stops, right? That you need an explanation for how such a process comes to be, and at the time, he considered that inconceivable what such a theory would look like. And I looked up the times. This was around exactly the same time that was it Carnot or no, it wasn't Carnot, the guy who coined the term entropy, right? And so the beginning of the idea of the second law, and, which later Schrödinger very much tied to the question of the origin of life through this notion of negentropy, right? And I think since then, sort of in more uh, mainstream biophysics research, I think the idea of a agent as a thermodynamic ratchet has become more formally grounded. And one of my favorite attempts at this, I think Baron Diaron's work was mentioned by Dave in the last meeting. That autonomous agency turn requires that the system select really its coupling in relation to its viability, right? So this question of viability is sort of that minimal criteria, right, that facilitates open-ended novelty via duplication. Where error-prone duplication is essentially what has to be construed through these thermodynamic models. And I think quite a few years ago, when I was still in my biophysics days, Jeremy England made quite a bit of splash towards this, and like making some of these, using these equalities, Jarzynski equalities, which were some of the main results from the far from equilibrium thermodynamics literature, to make these direct connections, right, between something like what you may call fitness, right, self-replication ability, right, proficiency of a physical process, and its energy consumption, entropy production, and putting sort of these hard limits on what they may be. But I think most importantly, kind of beginning to, this is something that I mentioned very early in the talk, this relationship between metabolism and information, right? It kind of baffles me how little this relationship is talked about, that the main energy currency of all of life is the same as the molecule that's used in information transmission process. So I'm talking about the ATPs and GTPs, which are the A's and G's of the ATGC of DNA construction. You may write this off as a sort of accident, right, of this particular development of life on our particular planet. But this is an idea that I think, and also got this. I heard this articulated by Deacon as well. That this I think points to a potentially more general, more important sort of design principle. If I hate to use that term again because of the teleological connotations that it brings up, but anyways, I'm kind of running out of steam. I haven't given a talk this long in a while, so I will. Since there's 20 minutes left, I think I'll just open it up to questions because I haven't heard any questions. I'm worried that I've lost the audience. So if anyone would like to ask anything, please let me know.
Okay, well, I had a quick biology question about that last slide.
Mhm.
So would you say that the double use of ATP there provides some hint as to whether metabolism or replication came first?
Yeah,
Like,
that's
are we imagining that you start with an ATP metabolism and then say I can exapt my ATP production to also store information? Or do you start from information and then say, some of this genetic code is useless. What if I lit it on fire to power myself?
That is precisely you're asking exactly the right question. I think I definitely am following Terry Deacon. So Terry Deacon has this origin of life hypothesis in his book Incomplete Nature, and it very much falls in this metabolism first camp, right? So the dominant mainstream view these days that we learn in our textbooks is this RNA world hypothesis. It's very much an information first, right? Or I guess replicator first. There's different ways of organizing these original life theories, but I would personally favor this, as you may have gathered from my earlier comments, that the importance of metabolism and just embodiment, right? So this is why I asked David about this sphere he had in his constellation, which was the body or embodiment. And I think embodiment, precisely again, because of the importance of the just physical constraints on embodiment and fighting the second law, right? Like you cannot carrying a body, just carrying any kind of um, information is by definition energetically costly, right? Because that information is subject to dissipation and destruction, right? And so I feel like you are much better on much more solid ground if you start by solving that problem, addressing the problem of metabolism and the energetic costs that are involved and accruing that or accommodating that energetic sort of accounting that you'll need to carry the information forward. And I think information is another one of these words like agency, like that are, I think you've very much been um, uh, following the amazing work of Claude Shannon, obviously, it's defined information in a very particular sense, right? That speaking of dogmas and maybe paradigms, I feel like there's some room for loosening the notion of information to accommodate some of these, um, I would say, more Darwinian evolutionary aspects of. Um, Preservation, I suppose. Like it's like you don't necessarily like there's this uh, issue that I feel like a lot of complexity researchers right encounter when it comes to Shannon entropy that a as Terry likes to say a frog in a blender is much more complex according to these Shannonian notions than a living breathing frog, right, which just cannot possibly be reasonable. Kier, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, it's actually it's work you might want to look into on almost exactly that. You've kind of it's Kolchinsky and it's semantic information theory. And
Yeah.
it's very good. It was one of the things I was like it was one of those things that papers that you like sort of blows your mind reading it or and
Thanks. Yeah.
it's like it is Shannon entropy, but it's Shannon information, but it's I think it's between like you add sort of there's all the possible sort of I'm gonna call them like protocols, like driving protocols that will like destroy the information in the system. And it's sort of like I can't remember how the like temporal dynamics sort of fit into it, but it's like essentially looking at the semantic information is essentially the information about preserving something's identity over time or something like that. I kind of forget how temporal dynamics fit into it, but it's very similar to that.
Thanks. Yeah, I've definitely come across it. I haven't had the bandwidth to, as you can tell, my thoughts on this last point, the first dogma, are pretty scattered. It's mostly nostalgia for a lot of things that I started exploring during the end of my biophysics years, and I haven't really been able to pursue. But I think work by Aguilera, I'm quite excited. I'm just anticipating your, question about what kinds of research do I find interesting, Hadi.
Oh,
I think Miguel has done really cool work just trying to I think this is on the shoulders of other giants like Susan Still, I think in Hawaii, I think has done a lot of this work trying to relate these thermodynamic equalities or inequalities with very cognitive constraints, right? Like, for example, with memory, right? Like the thermodynamic cost of carrying information forward in time, which is essentially memory, right? That has thermodynamic costs, and a lot of these, or even like in rate distortion theory, right? In that sort of space. A lot of people, the original like work by Tishby et al. Has relied on these, what is essentially these equilibrium, like free energy notions, right? Which are equilibrium notions, right? But some folk, like Daniel Braun, I think, in Germany as well, have sort of extended that to these non-equilibrium or far from equilibrium relations, just to try just as people have tried to use these thermodynamic concepts like free energy to talk about lossy compression and lossy information compression in informational cognitive agents, right? I think there's this like extension of that same work to the non-equilibrium setting, which I think opens up some of these. As I said, like this work by England, specifically statistical physics of adaptation, right, very explicitly places these evolution processes in the where they belong, which is these non-equilibrium like adaptation by definition, right, is this regardless of whether you want to call it open-ended or not, it is a dissipative, far from equilibrium system. It just has to be like there's no other way to get these duplications, to get duplication by error that will get you adaptation.
Yeah, I really appreciate that you took this kind of non-equilibrium statistical mechanics approach to adaptation. And maybe there is, first of all, yeah, I guess this problem of defining things precisely enough so that people can build on it, like what is an agent? Adaptation to me is also just as important. And, you mentioned the notion of Shannon information may not be enough. And I don't know about semantic information. I'm going to look it up. But I wanted to add one more thing that is very interesting. It's the relative information. It's the KL divergence between two distributions that is more natural and fitting to these types of questions. Like, for example, there's this very famous theorem in statistical mechanics, Crookes fluctuation theorem, that says if you go from the prior distribution to a posterior distribution, and that costs you energy. There's like a relationship between the entropy production and how much work you have to do that. And you can actually think about that as inference, like when you're going from this current set of beliefs and you process novel information and then adapt to the statistics of the input. So that's one thing I wanted to mention, which I think is worth pulling on that thread. Another thing is that just foreshadowing next week's talk. One way to define an agent is just to think how is an agent different from a non-living inanimate matter is that the agent has more empowerment than the non-living matter. At the same time, the agent also is far driven far outside of equilibrium compared to that inanimate matter. And I think these are two facts about agents, but I wonder if there has been a formal connection established between these two. It's something to think more about. I wonder if you have thoughts about that kind of connection.
Yeah. So because I've spent a fair bit of time on RDT. I was hoping that RDT would be sort of my the way to formalize this relationship between metabolism and information or reward, really, right? Like I thought that's why I pursued that whole line of research. And Daniel Braun, who I mentioned, he's applied precisely those Crookes relations, Jarzynski equalities, and whatnot to actually sensory motor data from humans. I think it's a Nature paper. I'll look it up. I'll send it to you. I think might be interesting for this group in particular. And like I said, that kind of is like a non-equilibrium extension of these RDT free energy paradigms. But you asked you asked you were talking about the empowerment work, right? And my understanding is that I forget who it was. It was I think was it Genevine? No, I don't think it was Genevine. I think it was Liebfried, who and colleagues. I forget Grau, Moya, Liebfried. I think they're all at DeepMind actually. They did this sort of unification of RDT with empowerment, right? And um, and it's a pretty straightforward relationship, right? Like so in RDT, you're basically trying to minimize the information, right, between the stimulus and the reward. At least that's how in application to RL, it's those variables are interpreted. In empowerment, you're trying to maximize the sorry, not the reward, the stimulus and the action. And in you're trying to maximize the mutual information between the stimulus and the action. Right? So one's minimizing, one's maximizing. There's some subtlety there in that you're not the variables in the sort of Markov chain. You're actually with empowerment, you're maximizing mutual information between the action of the next state, right? And the state that you started with. Right? So, but anyways, I'm just trying to say that my understanding of the relationship between empowerment and um, I can't fit it into this evolutionary perspective because in my mind, it's still very much part of this objective-based model of um, uh, intrinsic motivation, right? So this is what I also said earlier. I wish I had made a slide on intrinsic motivation and all these various different maximum entropy, maximizing empowerment, etc. Like at the end of the day, I feel like those fall within that objective-driven, convergent mode of just lashing on yet another auxiliary term in the reward function without actually accounting for where the reward function actually comes from, right? And not to dismiss these as likely these exist, like these tendency to engage in play or in like these may very well be instrumental goals, right, with clear objectives that are optimized, right, that are planted there by evolution, right, hard-coded into our brains, right? But I guess the radical suggestion here, which I haven't quite dared to to express here, is that just as Zathmary and colleagues um, conceive of evolutionary selection mechanisms being possible within the brain, right, within a lifetime, right? The really radical hypothesis, I guess, here, and I'm really afraid to say this out loud because it really is kind of crazy, is that not only are these evolutionary processes possible in the brain, but like something akin to the origin of life or like origin of an evolutionary process to begin with is potentially what's taking place in the brain. And that's not necessary for any of the things that I said, right? But I suppose I just wanted to touch on this. You raise this question of empowerment, intrinsic motivation, right? That I feel like ultimately the kind of truly intrinsic, non homuncular kind of motivation. That's not just like that we can't just defer to evolutionary um, distillation or like distillation into our brains, into our actual wiring, right, upon birth. The kind of agency that we that may be attributable that is genuinely like it originates during our lifetime may actually require that you accommodate for this crazy possibility that something, not literally the origin of life of living organic matter, but like something akin to these dynamics, right? Like a process, a sort of what did Darwin call it? A warm pond, right? In which these kinds of self-replicating processes dynamics, neural dynamics, can come to be, right? And then be selected upon, right?
So my one of the big takeaways for me from today is that your emphasis on this open-endedness and non-objective dynamics, and it's worth mentioning there's a paper from Joel Lehman, who you cited several times, about Knightian uncertainty with a K, about the unknown unknowns, and that paper actually attacks the very foundation of RL, the MDP formula, the probabilistic formulation of RL, and so it's like so even the first dogma, even the RL part is not fully settled. Like people are challenging the MDP because it's probabilistic and there's no notion of unknown unknowns. It violates those like probably the von Neumann axioms of probability and so on. So yeah, I think it's worth taking seriously. And Dave has go ahead, Dave.
I was just going to share the link to Lemon's paper. That's a beautiful paper as well. I love that work. I had a kind of related question, but Mani, if there's anything you want to respond to from Hadi, feel free to. to jump in quick
No,
before
no,
I...
no. I've come across that paper. Thanks for reminding me. I will definitely
Yeah.
have to take a look at that paper. Thanks.
Awesome. No worries. So I had a similar kind of question, which is about, I guess there's a few of these branching points that you've pointed out. So I love the talk as well. I love the paper. So thank you again. One that you point out is this move to this open-ended setting, this open-ended notion of a goal. And I'll need to think more about your point that the door you walk through is perhaps the first one, that's to say that goals are not well thought of in terms of preferences. My question is related to that point, though. So the question of where do rewards come from, I guess we could equivalently ask, where do goals come from? And RL has just made the commitment to formalize goals in terms of rewards. But even if we move away from rewards, we're still left with the question of where goals come from. Is the move in open-endedness away from that first door, so to this notion of, say, these terminal goals, is this to say we're not going to write down a goal in the spirit of, say, the myth of the objective? Or is it to some other kind of mechanistic structure, something more like an account to, say, satisficing, that's going to retain a question of where does the source of, say, the threshold come from, or what counts as satisficing and what doesn't? Or is it a more genuine departure?
No, I think that's accurate. And I think we are deferring to these terminal goals as sort of the ultimate origin of goals. But I guess the important point here is that just because, like, I feel like people like in that Singh Barto paper, right? Just kind of like ironically use evolution as a homuncular explanation, like just as if by saying evolution did it, we've explained what how this mechanism, how the terminal goals come to be. And I think the mechanistic types of explanations that they're like, this idea of niche selection or construction, idea of minimal criteria, the idea of coevolution, like these require certain machinery. You don't get these for free. These are not just a random search processes, right? Just because you have something randomly generating variations, right? As like I'm just trying to make this historically like relevant. Like I imagine like Darwin got these ideas from geology, right? Like there things variation takes place, is generated throughout the world by non-living processes, right? Like that alone, just random generation variation isn't sufficient to account for what we mean here by a terminal goal, right? Like it's does that help? I'm mostly agreeing with what you said, which you said it much better than I did. I'm just
No,
trying
that
to
does make
highlight that.
Yeah, for sure. And I can imagine the pair of us could have, we'll probably continue this conversation. I would love to talk more. If I may, I know we're basically at time, so I don't want to take us too far afield. There's a line of work from Les Valiant on evolvability. So Valiant, right, was the pack learning creator, and following pack learning, he came up with this really asked a question of what is evolution doing from a computational perspective that makes it kind of powerful enough to search through the space of organisms more effectively than random search. It's quite a cool line of work, and it has a pack flavor to it, so it has some kind of supervised learning elements, but I think it tries to give some kind of answer of computationally what could be going on with evolution to get us the kinds of learners that we might see, at least in the abstract. So I'll just leave with a question, and then I know we're basically at time, but is that the kind of explanation you might be looking for to that last question? Is something that's like a theory that says this is what underlies the sorts of processes that could in principle give rise to this notion of an open-ended goal? or is it something else? Like, can you say a little more about like what would it look like to what's the template of an answer to that kind of question?
Yeah, when you mentioned evolvability, my mind originally went to this concept of evo-devo, which is, I think, actually, when we talk about evolution, I'm actually like evolution on steroids is evo-devo, and all the mechanisms, very rich, powerful mechanisms that it has for creating variation, but also evolvable variation. I think Jeff Clune and Ken Stanley again have published a decent bit on evolvability. But I think you're correct to sort of try and draw me back to my original um, claim here, I suppose, with respect to terminal goals and trying to, yeah, I suppose both with by my goal with trying to show that evolution is complex, right? There's many that it doesn't come for free, right? That the kind of evolution I think is truly worthy of is how evolution is actually operating, right? Is doesn't come for free, and it took Stanley and others keen insights and inspirations from biology to try and extract specific mechanisms that can facilitate that kind of open-ended novelty search behavior of evolution, right? Not merely fitness optimization, right? But also open-ended search. But I suppose, I mean, I've repeated that several times. So yes, I suppose that is kind of what I'm trying to draw attention to, that these rich mechanisms, probably of which there are probably more, and these evo-devo mechanisms of, for example, duplication, degeneration, complementation. This is a big sort of topic in Evo-Devo, and something that actually inspired a lot of the early work by Ken Stanley on these hyper-neat architectures, where they try to emulate essentially these developmental programs that evolution then modifies in order to create variation, composable variation. But aside from these, like, studying biology and evolutionary theory carefully and extracting these important subtle mechanisms that make it as powerful as it is sort of one agenda here. But the other one, I suppose, is what I really struggled to communicate a few minutes ago. I really botched it, I think, but it has to do with this the first dogma, right? And the thermodynamic work, right? Because really, like, sure, I feel like Ken Stanley and others have really figured out all these mechanistic details as to, once you have an evolutionary system up and running, right? What kinds of how do we best emulate its open-ended diversity maximizing nature, right? But again, they don't provide any account of as to how an evolution process gets kickstarted in the first place, right? And I feel like if we do want to take seriously these proposals, I don't know. It's not absolutely necessary, like I was saying earlier. But I'm tempted to think as that it would be productive to think about more general theories, like substrate independent, not necessarily dealing with amino acids and nucleotides, or like specific neural substrates, for example, right? Which is more general mathematical theory, which I think will ultimately look like a thermodynamic theory, right? That will be necessary to account for how to kickstart, how to seed these evolutionary entities in the first place, right? So let me just maybe, sorry, I'll stop there, and if I don't know if that, let me know if that cleared anything up.
That definitely resonates for me, and it has sparked some more questions, but I'll maybe pause for a moment to let this up.
And maybe just to kind of anyone who would like to leave, obviously feel free, but I'll just say that what Zathmary and colleagues, how they accommodate this evolutionary mechanism is that they imagine a grid of reservoirs, and reservoir computers, I imagine this crowd is probably familiar with, basically a bunch of RNNs that are randomly initialized, right, and exhibit really rich sort of edge of chaos type behavior. But what they each, so they have a readout neuron, they create some a temporal pattern, and that pattern using they go to some length to show that the existing well-known laws of plasticity can accommodate the duplication of this pattern across the grid, and therefore creating these competition selection um, behaviors. And that's their way of essentially telling me like I imagine this would be their response to me that no, you don't really need to like a theory of origin of life or the thermodynamics of um, of replication or adaptation, as Jeremy England would call it. I really none of you don't need to cross that level of resolution. Already, this is sufficient for us to account for everything we want to account for in a evolutionary theory of learning within brains. And frankly, like it may very well be like I just feel like again maybe this is my nostalgia for these deep insights that I feel like thermodynamics have yielded outside the realm of thermodynamics, right? Like the whole notion of information is very much thermodynamically sort of bounded and rooted in just the history of the development of these ideas, very much entangled. And I guess just a suspicion that poking our noses a little bit further on that front and trying to actually account for uh, not settling for just a descriptive account of how replication could happen in one uh, possible substrate that can yield deeper insights. And I suppose this is maybe coming from again my interest in the link between metabolism uh, and um, and information, because what this refusing to go any sort of drop deeper into the mechanisms with which these patterns are generated and replicated and selected upon, it doesn't give you any access to the metabolic sort of details of how these things, how constrained these entities are. And I feel like this is something that I didn't get to go into. And again, but I think I kind of in passing did mention this, that I feel like our current models of resource rationality or bounded rationality, as you want to call them, they're all very much objective oriented, right? They don't respect this notion of um, this evolutionary notion of satisficing, right? They just try to account for model resource rational decision making by modeling it as a constrained optimization problem, right? Which is what all these are. These and even the non-equilibrium ones, right? That's basically what they how they construe it. But so I suppose that I being invested and interested in this uh, question of metabolism, energy consumption, and um, problem solving, the relationship between them, I feel like I would like to see a thermodynamic account of how these replicators actually come to be.
I should maybe do a shameless plug here. I'm very interested in kind of the idea of metabolism and information processing and how they could be formally related. And it turns out you can actually it's basically just rate distortion theory, but if you make specific choices about the distributions you optimize, then it turns out the literal firing rate of neurons, which is the main source of energy consumption, can be formally related to information rate through KL. So um, I'll send that to you if you're interested.
Yeah,
But
please
yeah, there's
do.
no open-endedness. So yeah, you gave me a lot to think about. I think that it's incomplete without this aspect.
Yeah, no, please do send that. And I'm sorry, I really did fan out into a lot of different branches here towards the end. I definitely don't, yeah, expected all these to be connected. But yeah, the absence of open-endedness doesn't bother me there. So please do share that. Yeah.
Well, definitely. Thank you. Any more questions? Okay, I'm gonna stop recording now.